Tonight, we're diving into the unusual and often harsh world of Aztec justice, a civilization renowned for its complex calendars, magnificent pyramids, and, yes, its intense customs. Beyond the ceremonies, the Aztecs had a legal system with punishments that were as imaginative as they were frightening. Before we settle in, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing if you truly enjoy this content. And do let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see our global audience. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Imagine this. You steal food, only to be dragged naked through the city streets while chili powder is rubbed into your wounds. Or you're forced to inhale smoke until you faint, just for felling the wrong tree. These weren't random acts of cruelty. This was Aztec law, where punishment served as both a public spectacle and a core societal principle. So, what were some of the most bizarre, brutal, and occasionally surprising ways the Aztecs maintained order? Let's find out. When people think of the Aztec Empire, images of human sacrifices, blood-stained pyramids, and obsidian knives often come to mind. It's not exactly a picture of a lenient society. Yet, the Aztecs didn't simply punish anyone who displeased them on a whim. They operated within a structured legal framework. This system was surprisingly organized, even sophisticated. While undeniably severe, it was far from chaotic. Aztec justice followed specific rules, codes, and a structure that would impress any modern bureaucracy. Laws were compiled in a collection known as the Huheti, which contained wise sayings and instructions covering everything from marital conduct and marketplace etiquette to avoiding a gruesome public end. These laws were passed down through generations. While there weren't traditional law books, there were specialized judges, officials who took their duties with utmost seriousness. You wouldn't find powdered wigs, but stern expressions and an encyclopedic knowledge of punitive options were common. They even had appellate courts, allowing you to appeal your case to higher judges, though success was unlikely if the community already considered you a repeat offender, like that person who stole corn twice. Judges were often priests or respected elder nobles, individuals esteemed for their wisdom, experience, and deep understanding of legal traditions. While not entirely immune to bribes, attempting to bribe them could result in execution, ensuring everyone approached the system with caution. What truly distinguished Aztec justice was its fusion of moral decree and elaborate public display. Justice wasn't just administered, it was publicly performed. Punishments were designed to teach lessons not in quiet seclusion, but loudly, openly, and often with theatrical flair. You didn't just pay a penalty. You might be shaved, painted, publicly dragged, or symbolically turned into a walking cautionary tale. And here's a distinctly Aztec element. Some punishments varied based on social class. Nobles were held to stricter standards and faced harsher consequences. A commoner might receive a fine or a flogging, but a noble committing the same offense could lose land, titles, or even their life. So, Aztec justice wasn't arbitrary. It was precise, symbolic, public, and decidedly dramatic. Break the law, and the empire ensured both you and your neighbors would never forget it. Imagine you've broken an Aztec law. Perhaps you drank forbidden pulque, or stole a basket of maize, or, hopefully not, cut down a sacred tree. Whatever your transgression, you're about to face the Aztec court system. Don't bother summoning a lawyer. There weren't any. Aztec courts were highly structured, yet far from comforting. Envision a stone platform surrounded by solemn figures in feathered cloaks, rather than a cozy courtroom drama. Trials were public, often held in a plaza or temple court, and weren't designed for theatrics, unless you count the possibility of being shaved, painted, or whipped before a crowd. Cases were typically heard by judges known as Tlaxcatlan, wise elders or noblemen rigorously trained in the empire's laws and customs. They weren't randomly selected. They studied for years, memorizing vast portions of the legal code and mastering the art of detecting deception from a distance. You didn't argue with them unless you particularly enjoyed public flogging. The accused could defend themselves, and sometimes a family member or elder might speak on their behalf. But realistically, unless you were exceptionally persuasive or extraordinarily lucky, things likely wouldn't go in your favor. There were witnesses, evidence, and even multiple levels of courts, including a high court and an appeal option to the emperor. Yes, you could take your case to the very top, but the path was arduous, and if the emperor found you guilty, let's just say there wouldn't be much bureaucratic aftermath. One striking characteristic of Aztec justice was its swiftness. They didn't believe in prolonged trials or years of legal debate. Judgments were immediate, and punishments often followed on the same day, terrifyingly efficient. Also, there were no jails. Aztec society didn't imprison criminals. You were either fined, publicly humiliated, enslaved, or executed, and sometimes a combination of all four. But you were never forgotten. Aztec courts weren't concerned with legal technicalities. They prioritized moral clarity, social order, and public display. So, if you ever stood before an Aztec judge, stand tall, speak carefully, and try not to visibly sweat. They tended to notice such things. In most cultures, misbehaving children receive a timeout or a stern lecture. In the Aztec Empire, they encountered something a bit more potent: the chilly smoke chamber. It was perhaps history's most dramatic way of saying, "Listen to your mother." In Aztec households, obedience was non-negotiable. Children were expected to work, obey, respect elders, and contribute to the family. The goal was straightforward: train them early to become responsible citizens, diligent workers, and future warriors or weavers. If young Cuauhtémoc refused to sweep or dared to talk back, he faced the chili. This punishment, known as Tlaxcatlan Shelley, involved placing the disobedient child in a small, enclosed space, like a hut or storage room, where chilies were burning on a fire. As they burned, the room filled with an intense smoke that caused burning eyes, constricted throats, and screaming sinuses. Think pepper spray, but with a spiritual undertone. The child wasn't physically harmed, at least not permanently, but the experience was unforgettable. They weren't bruised or bleeding. Instead, they were overwhelmed. The sensory assault of chili vapor achieved the effect of hours of parental lecturing in mere minutes. The objective wasn't cruelty, but shame-based conditioning. Once you'd coughed up your inclination to misbehave, you were unlikely to sass your parents again, at least until your voice returned. Other punishments for children included being pricked with cactus spines, forced public sweeping of temples, or made to carry firewood bundles beyond their strength. These acts weren't about gratuitous humiliation. They were corrective measures. In a society where everyone had a social duty, discipline was not optional. Even noble children were not exempt. In fact, they were held to even higher standards. A noble boy who disrespected a teacher or elder could be bound, beaten, or even temporarily enslaved. Not permanently, but enough for the lessons to sting, both figuratively and literally. So, growing up Aztec meant that rebellion came with real consequences, and likely a few tearful, fiery afternoons spent enduring chilly smoke. Spicy, yes. Effective, definitely. And let's be honest, no one ever forgot their first chili sauna. The Aztec Empire had one of the most severe stances on theft in the ancient world. Stealing wasn't merely a moral failing. It was an assault on the very fabric of society. Food, tools, cloth, firewood, everything held value, and taking what wasn't yours offended not just your neighbor, but also the gods. And the punishment? Let's just say the Aztecs weren't known for their subtlety. For first-time offenders, consequences were relatively mild. A thief might be compelled to return the stolen items, offer restitution, or face public shaming. Perhaps a few lashes or a haircut that loudly proclaimed, "I'm a thief," painful but survivable. However, a second offense entered the realm of enslavement. The Aztecs didn't have prisons. They preferred that you work off your debt, quite literally. Caught a second time, you might be handed over to the victim as a personal servant. You would labor in silence, your dignity stripped, every step a reminder that honesty would have been simpler. Now, if you were audacious and or foolish enough to steal a third time, things turned gruesome. The third punishment often involved ritual skinning. Not quick, not clean, and certainly not private. It was slow, ceremonial, and publicly displayed. This wasn't merely about inflicting pain. It was about profound symbolism. The skin was considered a sacred layer, an integral part of one's identity. To remove it was to utterly dismantle your being in the eyes of the community. Sometimes the skin was removed in strips, other times whole, and it wasn't discarded. In religious ceremonies, a priest might even wear the skin for a brief period, honoring the earth goddess and representing rebirth and punishment in one macabre package. Horrifying? Absolutely. And that was the intention. This form of justice wasn't solely about the individual. It was about the message. A skinned thief in the market square prevented 1,000 future crimes. It made you reconsider before pilfering tamales or secreting a jade bead into your tunic. The Aztecs believed in law, consequence, and the power of example. Their message was stark. Steal once, we warn you. Steal twice, we put you to work. Steal 3 times, and you won't be needing your skin. In the Aztec Empire, marriage was a profoundly serious matter. More than just a social contract, it was a sacred bond intricately connected to cosmic balance, family honor, and economic alliances. So, when someone violated that bond with extracurricular romantic activity, the consequence wasn't divorce court. It was death by blunt object. Let's start with the basics. Adultery was not treated as a private scandal. It was a capital crime, publicly prosecuted, and severely punished. And it wasn't just men who could accuse. Women could also bring charges. If you were caught, the empire didn't offer counseling. If a man was found intimately involved with another man's wife, the wronged husband had options, and none involved second chances. The most common penalty was public execution, often by bludgeoning with a stone club, a heavy instrument called a macuahuitl, which was a sword-like weapon embedded with obsidian blades. For domestic dishonor, the blunt version sufficed, painfully and thoroughly. Sometimes, the punishment wasn't left to the courts. In certain cases, the offended spouse could carry out the sentence personally. Talk about definitive closure. Women caught cheating faced equally grim fates. Death by strangulation, stoning, or being thrown off a cliff were all possibilities, depending on the region and the specific nature of the betrayal. Nobles, naturally, were held to stricter standards because when the wealthy cheat, it's not merely scandal, it's potential dynastic collapse. And let's not forget the public spectacle. If the affair was exposed, the accused might be paraded through the streets, mocked, shaved, and painted, all before facing their final punishment. Shame was not a side effect. It was an integral part of the sentence. Now, if someone falsely accused you of adultery, that was a different matter. Lying about adultery could also lead to execution. The Aztecs didn't tolerate character assassination unless it was backed by evidence, and they took witness testimony very seriously. So, no spreading rumors for revenge, unless you enjoyed playing with obsidian. At its core, Aztec marriage was a sacred institution, and violating it wasn't just a moral slip. It was an insult to society, the gods, and the law. So, if you ever wondered whether ancient civilizations valued monogamy, in the Aztec Empire, the answer was a resounding yes to death. You've heard of being punished for theft, murder, even adultery, but what about cutting down the wrong tree? In the Aztec Empire, some trees weren't just wood with leaves. They were sacred. They embodied deities, ancestors, or the very equilibrium of nature. And if, in your infinite wisdom, you decided to chop one down for firewood, well, say goodbye to your home and possibly your dignity too. Certain trees, especially those near temples, marketplaces, or shrines, were considered divinely protected. Damaging one was seen as a spiritual transgression, not merely an act of vandalism. You weren't just harming nature, you were insulting the cosmic order. The punishment for a first offense might involve a public beating, often with cactus spines or thorny branches. Yes, they made nature itself punish you, poetic justice with a prickly edge. But that wasn't the worst of it. In many cases, you'd also be compelled to pay restitution in goods, labor, or even face the loss of your home. Your property could be confiscated or burned. And in some regions, the offending tree cutter was paraded through town while villagers hurled insults and, occasionally, pebbles. The intention wasn't just to inflict physical pain. It was to broadcast to everyone that this individual had dared to meddle with the gods' landscaping. And if you were a repeat offender, you might be enslaved, particularly if the tree you harmed was near a sacred site. because apparently if you couldn't respect the roots of a tree, you didn't deserve roots of your own. To modern ears, it might sound absurd, punished for trimming a branch, but to the Aztecs, this was profoundly serious. Nature wasn't passive. It was alive, sacred, and deeply connected to the divine. Trees, rivers, mountains, they weren't resources. They were kin. Harming them without permission was akin to striking your grandmother and hoping no one noticed. So yes, if you lived in the Aztec Empire, you needed to know your botanical laws. That tree outside your neighbor's house? Better ask first. The shady one in the marketplace? Absolutely do not touch it. Because in this world, ignorance wasn't bliss. It was just flammable property and thorn-induced bruises. In most cultures, teenage drinking leads to a lecture, a bad hangover, or an awkward ride home with parents. In the Aztec Empire, it could end in execution. Let's be clear. The Aztecs weren't inherently against alcohol. They had a cherished, sacred drink called pulque, made from the fermented sap of the agave plant. It was frothy, slightly sour, and deeply significant in their rituals. Pulque was used in religious ceremonies, festivals, and even funeral rites. For adults, especially elders and priests, it was considered medicinal and divine. But for a teenager, one sip could be a death sentence. Young Aztecs were expected to be disciplined, respectful, and absolutely sober. Pulque was for those who had earned it through battle, age, or wisdom. Youth was a time for learning, not revelry, and drunkenness among teens wasn't just frowned upon. It was viewed as a moral collapse. So, if a teenager was caught drinking, the punishment was swift and severe. A first-time offender might be shaved bald, a mark of profound shame. Sometimes, they were paraded naked through the streets while villagers hurled insults or refuse. A mobile reminder that responsible choices are preferable to fermented ones. But for repeat offenders, the sentence escalated rapidly. Execution by strangulation or beating, often in public. The method wasn't chosen for dramatic effect. It was designed for lasting memory. One teenager hanging from a pole was enough to sober up the entire neighborhood for a generation. Even noble-born youth weren't spared. In fact, they were held to even stricter standards. A prince caught drinking might face ritual humiliation in the royal court or be sent to live in a cold, remote temple as punishment. The message was clear. Privilege doesn't excuse foolishness. Why such severity? Because the Aztecs regarded drunkenness as a form of spiritual decay, a gateway to laziness, disrespect, and disobedience. And in a civilization that depended on order, discipline, and cosmic balance, a tipsy teenager was a ticking time bomb. So, next time you envision a wild Aztec party, remember, unless you were elderly, high-ranking, or attending a funeral, your pulque cup stayed dry. Otherwise, your throat wouldn't. In the Aztec Empire, work wasn't merely a chore. It was a virtue, a sacred expectation, a civic duty woven into the very fabric of society. Everyone, from commoner to noble, had a role to play in the grand cosmic design. So, what happened if you didn't contribute your fair share? Let's just say you'd be working again very soon, though not by choice. Laziness, idleness, slacking off. These weren't treated as mere personality quirks. They were considered offenses against the gods, particularly Tlaloc, the god of rain and agriculture, and Tezcatlipoca, who closely monitored moral conduct. The gods didn't grant bountiful harvests for you to nap in the shade. If you disrespected the order of labor, the Aztecs ensured you would feel the consequences. If a man refused to work, refused to help his family, or consistently neglected his civic duties, he could be dragged into the marketplace and publicly shamed. His head might be shaved, his clothes replaced with rags. In some instances, he'd be forced to wear rotten garments or carry bundles of firewood through town while people shouted things like, "Behold the man who does nothing." But that was the milder version. Repeat offenders might be beaten with rods, tied to a post, or, if their laziness was seen as willful defiance, sold into slavery, not forever, but long enough to internalize the lesson. You're either useful or you're used. Even noble-born youths were closely supervised. If a young man of high rank refused to train for war or skip temple duties, his family could request he be sent to a house of youth correction, which sounds like summer camp but was more akin to a military boot camp, complete with cactus punishments. Laziness among women wasn't ignored either, though women had different duties. Grinding maize, weaving, tending the home. They too could be shamed for neglect. Mothers were expected to raise hardworking children, not ones who idled away chewing maize husks. The Aztec belief was simple. Idleness disrupts harmony. A lazy person jeopardizes their family's well-being, their community's balance, and the favor of the gods. So, if you were planning to lounge around the chinampa and skip your corn harvesting chores, better start running, because the punishment wouldn't be subtle and it wouldn't be optional. In the bustling heart of the Aztec Empire, the tianguistli, or marketplace, everything was negotiable except honesty. Selling spoiled fruit, watered-down pulque, or fake obsidian was not just bad business. It was criminal behavior. And the Aztecs had zero tolerance for marketplace deception. You weren't just breaking a rule. You were betraying the gods who blessed commerce, agriculture, and fair exchange. Every seller, whether hawking tamales or trading jade, was expected to adhere to strict ethical codes. Markets were sacred spaces, often overseen by special officials called paktika, who were market judges or inspectors. Their job was to patrol the stalls, listen for complaints, and catch those who slipped pebbles into their chili powder. If you were caught selling spoiled goods, punishment was swift and very public. A first-time offense might involve public shaming. Your stall overturned, your produce scattered, and your hands bound for all to see. Shoppers would walk by, spitting insults like, "There goes the liar with wormy avocados." Selling something falsely advertised, say, dyed feathers labeled as sacred quetzal plumes, was even worse. That could result in a beating, a fine, or in extreme cases, banishment from the market altogether. In a society where markets were your lifeline, banishment wasn't a timeout. It was economic death. Repeat offenders could be enslaved or branded, marked so future buyers knew never to trust your mangoes again. If your fraud caused real harm, like selling toxic herbs as medicine, you might even face execution, especially if the victim was of noble status. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about protecting trust. The market was where communities met, families survived, and tribute flowed. If buyers stopped trusting sellers, the entire structure began to crumble, and that could not be allowed. Even sellers of sacred goods, incense, ceremonial textiles, or idols were closely watched. If a temple merchant was caught selling low-quality items for high tribute prices, they weren't just scamming people. They were cheating the gods, and the gods didn't give refunds, they gave plagues. So, if you thought you could hustle your way through the market with a painted corn cob and a charming smile, think again. Because in Tenochtitlan, the phrase, "buyer beware," came with a very sharp edge. If you ever found yourself standing in an Aztec courtroom, surrounded by elders in feathered cloaks and facing judgment under the penetrating gaze of a priest judge, here's one golden rule. Do not lie. Seriously, don't embellish, don't misremember, and absolutely do not invent your own version of the truth. Because in the Aztec Empire, false testimony wasn't just unethical. It was deadly. The Aztecs held truth as a sacred principle, far more than just a courtroom courtesy. Telling the truth meant upholding order, harmony, and divine balance. Lies, on the other hand, corrupted the social structure and offended the gods, especially Tezcatlipoca, the god of night, judgment, and truth. He certainly didn't appreciate your creative storytelling. Court trials relied heavily on witness testimony. There were no security cameras, no forensic labs, just your word against someone else's, and that word carried serious weight. So, when you lied in court, you weren't just tipping the scales. You were potentially sending someone to their death or enslavement unjustly. The punishment for perjury was execution, often by strangulation, stoning, or being clubbed to death, depending on the region and the severity of your deceit. If the lie was proven after the trial, and your false words led to someone else's suffering, you'd often be made to suffer the same fate you caused them. It was poetic justice with sharp edges. Even lesser lies came with serious consequences. Public beatings, banishment, or ritual humiliation could follow. You might be painted black, the color of deceit, or shaved bald and paraded through the market with a sign around your neck reading something like, "Talks too much, tells too little truth." False accusers weren't just punished for lying. They were seen as threats to society itself, willing to manipulate justice, harm others, and risk divine anger for selfish gain. Aztec law wasn't about technicalities. It was about moral clarity, and in their eyes, truth was sacred, binding, and non-negotiable. So, if you ever stood in the plaza accused of a crime and thought a small fib might get you off the hook, remember, in the Aztec Empire, the truth could set you free, but a lie, it could bury you. The Aztecs believed in second chances, just not very many of them. Their legal system was harsh, but not entirely merciless. A first offense might earn you a warning, a fine, or a good public flogging to help you remember the lesson. A second time, and you'd face something more intense, perhaps public humiliation, servitude, or the loss of your possessions. But a third offense? That's when things turned serious, like ritual execution serious. To the Aztecs, repeated crimes weren't just a nuisance. They were proof that you had refused to live in balance, and balance in the Aztec worldview was everything. The crops grew because society functioned. The sun rose because people adhered to their roles. So, when someone broke the law repeatedly, they weren't just annoying. They were a threat to cosmic order. Let's say you were a thief. First time, you return the goods. Second time, you're enslaved. Third time, you're slowly skinned in public with the full backing of the law and, very possibly, the neighborhood. Or perhaps you lied in court again. The punishment wasn't just harsher than before. It was symbolic. Your repeated dishonesty rendered you inhuman in the eyes of society. And what happens to those who lose their humanity? They become examples, warnings, cautionary tales. And it wasn't just about physical punishment. Repeat offenders could lose their legal protection entirely. That meant anyone could harm, enslave, or publicly shame you, and you had no legal recourse. You weren't exiled, you weren't imprisoned. You were unpersoned. In some cases, a repeat offender could be permanently banished from the market, the village, or even their own family. Imagine being spiritually erased, not because the gods abandoned you, but because you abandoned the social contract one too many times. To the Aztecs, lawbreakers weren't inherently evil. They were correctable. But repeat offenders were something worse, unwilling to learn. And in a society where justice was public, swift, and divine, the state didn't waste time on those who refused to be rehabilitated. So if you got caught once, you were lucky. Twice, you were warned. But if you stood in that courtroom a third time, you were already gone. In modern justice systems, punishment often occurs behind closed doors, courtrooms, jail cells, private hearings. But in the Aztec Empire, justice was street theater. Punishment wasn't solely intended for the person who broke the law. It was designed to educate everyone else. The Aztecs believed that fear and shame were tools as vital as clubs and cactus whips. If someone witnessed your humiliation, they'd remember it long after the pain faded, and they'd think twice before stealing that tamale. That's why almost all punishments, from flogging to execution, were carried out in the open, usually in the center of the community, the plaza, the marketplace, or outside temples. These were the gathering places for trade, prayer, and socialization, perfect for teaching lessons in full view of friends, family, and enemies. Imagine this: you're caught lying or stealing. You're dragged to the plaza. A crowd gathers. Your clothes are torn, your head might be shaved, you're painted with black soot to mark your shame, and then the punishment begins. A beating, a binding, maybe a good chili smoking in a hut if you're still young and reckless. Children who disrespected elders might be made to carry heavy bundles of wood barefoot across town. Lazy workers could be paraded with signs around their necks. Adulterers could be stoned or strangled before a sea of silent, or not so silent, onlookers. Public punishment wasn't random cruelty. It was a ritual of memory. The Aztecs understood human psychology. Pain fades, but embarrassment echoes, and that echo kept society in line. There were no prison systems, no lifelong incarcerations. The point wasn't to disappear wrongdoers. It was to transform them or destroy them in plain sight. Even executions were spectacles. A thief might be flayed not in some dark back room, but in the square where he once sold stolen goods. His punishment became a living parable for every passerby. In Aztec law, privacy was for the innocent. The guilty were meant to be seen, heard, and remembered not just for what they did, but for what happened next. Because in this world, your real sentence wasn't just death or pain. It was becoming the lesson. In the Aztec Empire, punishment wasn't merely about what you experienced. It was about what you represented. It wasn't enough for you to suffer. You had to be seen, interpreted, and, above all, understood. Because justice in Tenochtitlan wasn't just a legal process. It was a performance, and you were the unfortunate star. Let's say you stole something: food, tools, clothing. If it was your first offense, perhaps you weren't beaten. Instead, your head was shaved, your body painted with black soot, and you were paraded around in humiliating clothes. Torn, oversized tunics or rags tied in knots that made you look ridiculous. Not physically painful, but symbolically devastating. Or say you lied in court. You might have your lips stained with charcoal to mark your deceit. Everyone would see it, everyone would know. It didn't matter if you told the truth later. The stain told its own story. Even colors held meaning. Black was associated with deceit and shame. Red might signify a serious offense. Striped or dyed clothing could be reserved for public punishments. The Aztecs understood that the human eye doesn't forget what it's been trained to fear. Noble offenders were treated no differently. In fact, worse. A noble child caught drunk might be dressed as a commoner and forced to sweep temple floors. A clear inversion of his status. To an Aztec audience, that image was powerful. This is what happens when the privileged dishonor their role. Even punishment tools were symbolic. Being beaten with cactus spines wasn't just about the pain. It reflected the natural world's judgment. Carrying heavy bundles of firewood symbolized the burden of guilt. A shaved head didn't just look odd. It meant you'd been stripped of social dignity. The message: crime wasn't a private mistake. It was a public rupture, a disruption in the sacred flow of order. And to heal it, society needed not just consequences, but images that endured, living reminders that law and morality were deeply intertwined. In short, Aztec punishment was a play, a visual story designed to be retold through gossip, song, and frightened memory. You weren't just a criminal, you were now a symbol. In most societies, punishment often concludes behind bars. Time served, walls built, a sentence measured in months or years. But in the Aztec Empire, there were no prisons. Why? Because the Aztecs didn't believe in warehousing problems. They solved them quickly, publicly, and very often permanently. To the Aztec mind, punishment wasn't about removing someone from society. It was about returning them to order or removing them from the world altogether. There was no need to feed a prisoner, construct a jail, or fund a guard system. Time wasn't the consequence. Shame, pain, or death was. If you stole, you might be enslaved and forced to work off your crime, but you didn't disappear. You remained in society as a cautionary example. If you lied, you bore the symbols of deceit on your body. If you committed a serious offense, the punishment came swiftly, with the community watching and the gods invoked. And if you couldn't be corrected, if you were a repeat offender, a danger to others, or simply defiant, then your story ended not behind a door with iron bars, but in the marketplace, the plaza, or the temple steps with no need for parole. Even noble prisoners, such as captured enemy rulers or high-ranking criminals, weren't jailed. They were housed temporarily in ritual captivity, treated according to their status until their scheduled execution or sacrifice. Their time wasn't served, it was counted down. There were, however, small holding rooms, not prisons, but places to detain someone briefly before their punishment. These were sparse, guarded by warriors, and not used for rehabilitation. You weren't sent there to change, you were sent there to wait. This system worked because Aztec law relied on immediacy and visibility. Delayed punishment weakened its impact. Invisible punishment, like imprisonment, deprived society of the lesson, and in Aztec eyes, the lesson was the most crucial part. So, while other civilizations built towers to conceal their criminals, the Aztecs constructed rituals to remind you. Break the order, and the consequences will be swift, public, and unforgettable. Because in this empire, they didn't need bars. They had balance. By now, you've likely realized the Aztec Empire didn't believe in lengthy second chances. Their punishments were swift, symbolic, and often painful, and that was precisely the intention. Because to the Aztecs, the purpose of justice wasn't rehabilitation. It was remembrance. Every punishment, whether a chili-smoked sauna, a cactus whipping, or being flayed in the plaza, was designed to etch the crime into collective memory. For the offender, for the bystanders, for the entire community. A culture without prisons relied on something far stronger. Fear, shame, and the kind of storytelling that begins with, "You'll never believe what I saw in the marketplace today." And that's what made the Aztec legal system so effective and so terrifying. It compelled people to remember because if you didn't, you might not live long enough to forget. The entire society was wired for moral clarity. Children were taught early that wrongdoing brought not only pain but public spectacle. Adults knew that crime wasn't just a personal failing. It was a cosmic imbalance. The gods didn't desire lengthy court cases. They demanded action, and the empire delivered. But here's the paradox. For all its brutality, the system worked, at least for them. Social order was maintained, markets ran smoothly, children were respectful, and priests weren't pickpocketed during ceremonies. And if you ever contemplated breaking a rule, all it took was one glance at the disheveled person with a shaved head and soot-smeared face limping past you, and suddenly, the rules became crystal clear. The Aztecs didn't just punish, they performed morality. Every crime was an educational opportunity, every consequence was theater. You learned not by reading a scroll, but by witnessing a punishment you absolutely never wanted to experience yourself. And if you couldn't learn, well, the system had a solution for that too. In a society without long-term prisons, those unwilling to learn were recycled into warnings. You either remembered the rules, or you didn't survive long enough to break them again. That was Aztec justice. Swift, symbolic, and unforgettable in every way that mattered. Before she became the bane of Roman merchants and the embodiment of maritime defiance, Tuda was a woman navigating the brutal politics of a rising Illyrian kingdom. She didn't inherit her throne peacefully. She married into it. As the wife of King Agrin of the Rdei tribe, one of the most formidable Illyrian confederations on the eastern Adriatic coast, Tuda entered a world dominated by warlords, smugglers, and sea raiders. Agrin was a powerful king, known for his military ambition and expansionist campaigns. Under his leadership, Illyria became a naval power to be reckoned with. But in 231 BCE, his sudden death, whether from illness or perhaps an excessive drinking binge, depending on ancient accounts, left the throne in a precarious state. Tuda stepped in, not as a grieving widow, but as the regent and commander for her underage stepson, Pins. This was no ceremonial role. Tuda didn't hide behind silk curtains awaiting advisors. She seized the reins of power and, crucially, command of the navy. Her rule coincided with a time when piracy wasn't just tolerated. It was practically a national industry. Illyrian pirates weren't criminals in the eyes of their own people. They were the economic backbone of the region. They raided merchant ships, extorted tribute, and controlled vital trade routes through the Adriatic and Ionian seas. Under Tuda's regency, piracy didn't just continue, it flourished. She encouraged it, sanctioned it, and fiercely defended it. To her, it was a legitimate form of warfare, and to many Illyrians it was an honorable profession. Tuda understood the geopolitical landscape. In a world where Athens' influence had waned and Rome hadn't yet fully extended its reach across the sea, she saw a power vacuum and filled it with Illyrian sails. But while she may have held sway over the Adriatic, her audaciousness would soon provoke a power that did not tolerate maritime interference. Rome, steadily but surely expanding its dominion, was watching. And as Illyrian piracy began to impact Roman trade routes, Tuda's reign would no longer be a regional matter. It would become an international problem, one the Romans decided required a very permanent solution. The Queen of the Rocks and Sea had awakened a giant. Tuda's pirates weren't just attacking isolated merchant vessels. They were striking at Roman convoys, demanding tribute from Greek cities under Roman protection, and even plundering ports along the western coastline. To Rome, this wasn't mere piracy. It was a direct affront. and Romans were not known for overlooking insults. By 230 BCE, Roman senators had reached their limit. The Senate dispatched a formal diplomatic mission to Tuda's court, a warning cloaked in diplomacy, but with an underlying threat. The lead ambassador, a Roman named Lucius Coruncanius, was known for his directness. His instructions were clear: inform the Illyrian queen to cease the piracy, or Rome would intervene. When the delegation arrived, they were likely received in Shkodra, Tuda's capital. Imagine the scene: marble columns, Illyrian guards with crested helmets, and a queen seated not in fear, but in full command. Tuda welcomed them, but when they delivered Rome's message, her response was chillingly defiant. She gave them the kind of answer only a monarch with grit would utter. In her own words, as later recorded by Roman historians, she asserted that Illyrian kings had always permitted their subjects to make a living however they pleased, including through piracy. She essentially told Rome that events at sea were beyond her control. It wasn't precisely the answer Rome sought. And then came a fatal error. One of the Roman envoys, perhaps emboldened by Roman arrogance or simply a lack of judgment, publicly insulted Tuda. He accused her of acting like a mere woman, implying she was weak, emotional, and unfit to rule. Whether it was sexism, poor diplomacy, or sheer stupidity, that remark cost him his life. Not long after, he was assassinated on Tuda's orders, a decision that would resonate all the way back to the marble floors of the Roman Senate. Rome erupted in outrage. Killing a Roman envoy was more than a diplomatic breach. It was an act of war. And not just any war. This would be Rome's first military campaign across the Adriatic, the precursor to its expansion into the eastern Mediterranean. Tuda had made her move, whether out of pride, policy, or sheer fury. She had crossed the line. Now Rome was coming, not with envoys, but with legions. The queen had awakened the Republic's wrath, and there would be no more warnings. Tuda likely understood that Rome's retaliation wouldn't be minor, but even she might have underestimated the sheer scale and speed of the Roman response. In 229 BCE, barely a year after the assassination of their envoy, Rome launched its first ever military campaign across the Adriatic Sea. It was swift, highly organized, and chillingly efficient. 2 consuls were dispatched with over 200 ships, a fleet that dwarfed anything Illyria had ever seen. This wasn't a typical raid or border skirmish. It was a full-scale invasion. Tuda, still ruling as regent and supreme commander of the navy, prepared her forces as best she could. But Illyria, despite its maritime prowess and fierce warriors, was a fragmented collection of tribes. Rome was a meticulously organized machine. The Romans wasted no time. They first targeted the Greek city-states along the coast that had been coerced or occupied by Illyrian forces. Corcyra, modern-day Corfu, which had been seized by Illyrian pirates, was liberated by the Romans and promptly transformed into a naval base. Apollonia and Epidamnus quickly aligned themselves with Roman protection. The message was unambiguous. The Adriatic would no longer be Illyria's exclusive domain. But Tuda wasn't in hiding. She sent her fleet out to defend the coasts, and Illyrian pirates continued to strike where they could. Yet the tide was turning. For every raid they launched, the Romans captured another stronghold. The Roman navy, though relatively new to the eastern waters, was learning rapidly and operating ruthlessly. As Rome advanced, more Illyrian allies began to surrender. Cities that once looked to Tuda for leadership now opened their gates to Rome, hoping for leniency. The loyalty she once inspired as the pirate queen began to falter, especially as Roman soldiers pushed inland, forcing a choice: stand with a besieged queen or ensure your survival. By the end of the year, Roman troops were within striking distance of Shkodra, Tuda's capital. What had begun as a defiant act, a queen protecting her people's way of life, was rapidly becoming a desperate siege. Tuda now faced a decision no monarch ever wishes to make: fight to the bitter end and risk annihilation, or yield to a foreign power. The queen who had once commanded the waves now found herself surrounded by enemy sails. Her fate, and Illyria's, hung precariously in the balance. With Roman forces tightening their grip on Shkodra and her allies crumbling one by one, Tuda's once formidable influence began to recede like a tide. Her network of coastal strongholds, crucial for resupplying ships and launching raids, was collapsing under Roman pressure. The Adriatic Sea, once an Illyrian domain, now bristled with Roman warships. The Queen of the Sea had lost her sea. But Tuda was no fool. She may have ruled with defiance, but she knew when to yield, especially when survival was at stake. In 228 BCE, facing overwhelming odds, she did what no one expected the proud pirate queen to do. She sued for peace. The negotiations were designed to be humiliating. Rome intended to make an example of her. They demanded she surrender most of the Illyrian coastline, give up key forts, and, most painfully, relinquish her beloved navy. Tuda was permitted to rule only a small inland portion of her former kingdom, and even there, she had to pledge never to sail beyond a narrow stretch of coastline with more than 2 unarmed ships. 2 unarmed ships for a woman who once commanded fleets. It was a symbolic emasculation. The sea was no longer hers. The title of Pirate Queen had been forcibly retired, and the Adriatic now answered to Rome. But even in surrender, Tuda wasn't entirely broken. Though her political power was severely diminished and her military reach clipped, she retained her title and remained regent for a short period. Her ability to survive the storm, quite literally, demonstrated the cunning and realism that had defined her rule. In a world where other defiant rulers were often executed or dragged in chains through Roman triumphs, Tuda was spared. Perhaps Rome respected her tenacity, or perhaps they feared turning her into a martyr. Still, her influence quickly waned. Soon after the peace agreement, Tuda vanishes from historical records. Her stepson Pins would eventually rule in name, though always under Roman oversight. Tuda, once a queen with command over waves and warriors, faded into silence. But she was far from forgotten. In Roman memory, she was the first to challenge them on the open sea, and in Illyrian legend, she remained a symbol of resistance. A woman who dared to defy a rising empire and nearly succeeded. Though Tuda's reign ended in surrender, her legacy laid the groundwork for one of the most crucial transformations in Mediterranean history: the emergence of Rome as a naval superpower. Ironically, it was her defiance that compelled Rome to adapt. Before Tuda, Rome had primarily been a land-based power. Its military strength came from its legions, its politics from the landowning elite, and its focus was always centered on the Italian peninsula. The sea was for traders and Greeks or for pirates like the Illyrians. But Tuda changed that. The First Illyrian War, triggered by her bold resistance and the assassination of a Roman envoy, was Rome's first serious engagement across the Adriatic. It necessitated building fleets, mastering sea routes, and learning how to occupy and administer coastal cities. This wasn't merely a temporary expedition. It was an initiation. Tuda didn't just provoke Rome. She forced them to expand. And Rome took notes. They didn't dismantle the pirate system and leave. They replaced it. After their victory, Rome established protectorates along the Illyrian and Greek coastlines, securing trade routes that had previously been at the mercy of Tuda's raiders. They installed friendly rulers, collected tribute, and established a lasting presence. The Adriatic, once Illyrian blue, now shimmered with Roman sails. It's easy to overlook the significance of this, but without Tuda, without the crisis she instigated, Rome might never have ventured across the Adriatic so soon, or it might have remained a landlocked empire for another generation. She was unintentionally a catalyst. Her resistance spurred innovation, her aggression triggered a transformation, and her fall marked a strategic shift in Roman foreign policy from guarding borders to crossing them. Of course, she didn't do this willingly. Tuda's goals were never to instruct Rome on how to build an empire. She was fighting to protect her people's independence, to legitimize Illyrian seafaring, and to maintain her authority in a male-dominated world. But like so many historical figures caught in the machinery of empire, her legacy would be written by her enemies. Still, one can't help but wonder, had Tuda not challenged Rome, would the Republic have crossed the Adriatic so soon? Or would it have remained a landlocked empire for another generation? Either way, Tuda's actions had changed the map, and history, ever the trickster, remembers even reluctant revolutionaries. Tuta's story isn't just about pirates and power struggles. It's also about gender. She wasn't simply a ruler. She was a woman ruling in a brutal, male-dominated world where command was usually earned on horseback or through bloodline, preferably both. And yet, here was Tuta, commanding fleets, making diplomatic decisions, executing envoys, and sparking international wars. The ancient world wasn't kind to female leaders. When women ruled, chroniclers, especially Roman and Greek, often resorted to caricature. Cleopatra was seductive, Boudica was wild, and Tuta, she was dangerous and irrational, at least according to Roman historians. Take Polybius, for example. He describes Tuta as a woman with a natural weakness of the sex. That line alone tells you what she was up against. Roman writers simply couldn't accept that a woman had provoked their republic into war and then held her ground for more than a year, so they attributed it to female emotion, not political savvy. But let's cut through the ancient propaganda. Tuta didn't rise to power through seduction or scandal. She did it through strategy and survival. She inherited a fragile throne after her husband's death and managed to maintain it amidst political chaos. She didn't inherit peace. She inherited piracy, tribal rivalries, and hostile neighbors, and she wielded those elements like weapons. Was she ruthless? Probably, but so were most rulers of the time. Her execution of the Roman envoy wasn't an act of hysteria. It was a calculated, if risky, political message. She was defending Illyrian sovereignty the only way she knew how, by force. And consider this, Tuta wasn't overthrown by her people. She wasn't betrayed in a coup or murdered in palace intrigue. She lost because Rome possessed overwhelming force. That's it. Her people didn't revolt against her. In fact, some of her followers resisted Rome long after she surrendered. Tuta's reign, short as it was, carved her name into a world that rarely made room for women in power. She stood toe-to-toe with the mightiest republic of the time and forced them to take her seriously, even if their historians tried to dismiss her. She was a queen in war, a ruler in crisis, and a woman who made the ancient world uneasy. Though her reign concluded in a humbled peace, Tuta's story refused to vanish beneath the waves. Centuries after her last ship was grounded and her voice fell silent, legend still whispered her name along the Adriatic coast. In Illyria, her image transformed from that of a defeated regent into something far more enduring, a symbol of national pride, resistance, and feminine authority. In Albanian folklore, particularly, Tuta became more than a queen. She was the defiant matriarch of a people standing alone against the rising tide of foreign domination. Her name was passed down not through dusty treaties, but in the oral histories of shepherds and sailors. Statues of her now stand in modern Albania and Montenegro, bronze reminders that some rulers outlived their empires. And what an empire it was! Illyria may never have rivaled Rome in size or infrastructure, but under Tuta's leadership, it held dominion over key sea lanes and coastal cities. She ruled during one of the last periods when Illyrian identity remained politically independent. After her fall, Rome began a slow, relentless assimilation of Illyrian culture, language, and governance. Tuta's surrender marked not just the end of a war, it marked the beginning of the end for Illyrian sovereignty. But while Rome buried her kingdom under provinces and prefectures, Tuta's memory survived. Her reign, brief though it was, became a rallying point for future generations seeking inspiration. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Balkan nationalism surged and countries like Albania began to forge new identities from ancient roots, Tuta was revived, not as a tragic figure, but as a hero. Textbooks praised her courage, and streets and schools bore her name. She wasn't just a queen anymore. She was an ancestor of defiance. Even in modern scholarship, her story continues to provoke debate. Was she a reckless pirate or a pragmatic leader forced to embrace piracy as state policy? Was she a tyrant or a woman cornered by her husband's death and the ambitions of an empire? Whatever the truth, Tuta occupies a rare space in ancient history. A woman who refused to apologize for her power and whose decisions, for better or worse, reshaped an entire sea. Her ships may have been scuttled, but her legend still sails. Over time, Tuta's historical reality blurred into something mythic, a figure half draped in truth, half draped in legend. And it's easy to see why. A queen ruling a coastal kingdom, commanding pirates, defying Rome, and vanishing from history without a clear end. That's the stuff legends are made of. In coastal towns like Kotter and Ulsange, stories are still told of a queen who once ruled from a towering castle by the sea. Locals will point to crumbling ruins and say, "That was Tuta's stronghold." Even when archaeology offers little proof, she is said to have thrown herself from cliffs to evade Roman capture, to have hidden treasure in secret island caves, and to have cursed the waters that betrayed her. None of it can be confirmed, but none of it has ever truly needed to be, because Tuta wasn't just a person anymore. She became a symbol, and symbols are immune to conquest. Even the sea seems to echo with her presence. The name Queen Tuta is engraved on modern cruise ships, hotels, and cultural festivals. Writers in the Romantic era painted her as a tragic heroine, while modern feminists in the Balkans praise her as an early icon of female leadership. Albania, in particular, has fully embraced her. Statues of Tuta, often depicted with windswept hair and a sword at her side, now grace public squares. School children learn her name alongside Skanderbeg. And yet, the real Tuta, the woman behind the myth, remains elusive. We don't know how she died, whether she ever regretted challenging Rome, or even what she looked like. Her image was crafted by others, often her enemies, and later reshaped by those who needed her as a legend. But maybe that's the mark of true influence. When your story refuses to obey history books. Tuta may have ruled for just a handful of years, but her shadow stretches across centuries. She lives on in poems, place names, and whispered tales across the Adriatic coast. The Roman Empire that once tried to erase her is gone, reduced to ruins and textbooks. But Tuta, she still sails in memory, the pirate queen becoming something greater, immortal. Today, Tuta's name resonates far beyond the annals of ancient history. Her story has been adopted, adapted, and echoed in ways she could never have imagined, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a cultural and national icon. In Albania, Montenegro, and across the Western Balkans, she represents something vital: the fierce independence of a people who refuse to be swallowed by empires. Her story speaks loudly in a region that has known centuries of occupation, division, and struggle. For Albanians especially, Tuta has become more than a queen. She's a symbol of national identity. Her legacy has been woven into the cultural revival movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, fueling resistance to foreign domination and inspiring pride in a pre-Roman Illyrian heritage. In a world where borders have shifted countless times, where languages and loyalties have blurred, Tuta is a constant, rooted in stone, salt, and defiance. Her name is found everywhere, from naval vessels and passenger ferries to sports teams, businesses, and even a women's football club. Schools teach her as a national hero. Statues of Tuta, sword in hand and gaze set on the horizon, overlook harbors once dominated by her fleet. She has become the Adriatic's eternal guardian, a queen not just of the past but of the cultural present. Her relevance doesn't stop at borders. In the broader conversation about women in leadership, Tuta has become an ancient case study. Her story offers a rare glimpse into female command in a time and place where that was almost unheard of. She challenges modern assumptions about gender and power in the ancient world. Her name is now cited alongside Cleopatra, Boudica, and Zenobia, women who dared to govern in a man's world and left an empire trembling in their wake. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part, that a woman so poorly documented by her contemporaries, remembered mostly through the insults of Roman writers, now stands tall as a figure of empowerment, sovereignty, and bold resistance. Tuta ruled for only a few stormy years, but her name has weathered centuries, and in every port that still remembers her, every story whispered to a child about the queen who defied Rome, Tuta sails on, not in warships but in memory. The sea was her kingdom, and her story her lasting throne. In 1803, the United States executed one of the most astonishing real estate transactions in history. With a signature and the exchange of $15 million, President Thomas Jefferson acquired a colossal tract of land from France, the Louisiana Territory. This wasn't just a few acres outside New Orleans. This was over 800,000 square miles of unexplored wilderness, stretching from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains and beyond. Jefferson was ecstatic. The land would provide ample space for westward expansion and secure control over vital trade routes. But there was one small problem. Nobody truly knew what lay out there. Maps were vague, rumors swirled about giant mountains, woolly mammoths, a mythical northwest passage to Asia, and river systems that could either lead to the Pacific or nowhere at all. Jefferson needed answers, and quickly. He wanted to transform that blank map into something tangible, something real. So, he devised a plan. Send a small, elite team west to explore the new territory, chart its geography, establish relations with native tribes, and ideally, discover a direct water route to the Pacific Ocean. For this unprecedented task, Jefferson turned to Meriwether Lewis, his personal secretary, a former Army captain with an insatiable curiosity for science and nature. Lewis, in turn, selected William Clark, an old friend, military veteran, and skilled outdoorsman, to co-lead the journey. The pair had distinct personalities. Lewis was contemplative and intense, while Clark was steadfast, practical, and sociable. But together, they complemented each other perfectly. Their mission was to gather information, not to conquer. They were to meticulously document everything: animals, plants, rivers, rocks, and languages. They were diplomats, naturalists, and explorers rolled into one. But let's be clear, this was no leisurely stroll. The expedition would lead them through untamed rivers, dense forests, scorching plains, and snowy mountains. There were no supply stations, no GPS, no lifelines, just handwritten journals, unwavering determination, and the hope that the Pacific lay somewhere in the uncharted West. Thus, the stage was set. A young nation had purchased a vast mystery, and two men were about to venture into it, armed with nothing but their courage and a presidential mandate. Before they could venture into the wilderness, Lewis and Clark needed a team, and not just any group of travelers. They required men capable of rowing upstream for weeks, hunting their own food, repairing broken equipment, fighting if necessary, and coexisting in close quarters with no privacy for years. In short, men tough enough to survive anything. This elite group would become known as the Corps of Discovery. In the winter of 1803 to 1804, recruitment began. Lewis and Clark established camp at Camp Du Bois, just north of St. Louis on the eastern side of the Mississippi River. This would serve as their training ground and staging area. They primarily recruited from military outposts, hardy frontiersmen, skilled riflemen, and disciplined soldiers. Most were in their 20s, single, and eager for adventure. Among them were individuals like George Drouillard, a master tracker and interpreter, and John Ordway, a strict yet capable sergeant who helped enforce discipline. Each recruit swore an oath to the expedition. This wasn't merely a scouting party. It was an arm of the U.S. government, carrying the aspirations of a growing nation. Lewis and Clark would lead, but every man had a vital role to play. Blacksmiths, carpenters, hunters, cooks, and even musicians were included to boost morale. Supplies were equally crucial. The crew loaded a custom-built keelboat, complete with a sail, oars, and a cabin. They packed trade goods to offer native tribes, beads, knives, mirrors, piece medals bearing Jefferson's image, as well as medical kits, scientific instruments, muskets, gunpowder, and over 200 pounds of ink and paper for journals. The men drilled daily throughout the winter. They practiced rowing, sailing, portaging, and marksmanship. They learned how to survive together, how to follow orders, and how to trust their captains. Discipline was strict. Desertion could result in flogging. But the unity they forged would become their greatest asset on the journey ahead. By May of 1804, the Corps was ready. Over 40 strong, they set off up the Missouri River, rowing against the current into a land few Americans had ever seen. It was the dawn of a journey that would take them over mountains, through tribal nations, and all the way to the Pacific, or so they hoped. On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery officially departed from Camp Du Bois, beginning their ascent of the Missouri River, North America's longest river. For the men on board, It marked the start of something legendary, though they had no idea how long it would last or what challenges they would face. The terrain ahead was uncharted, the maps blank. Everything was conjecture. The initial stretch of the expedition proved grueling. The Missouri's strong current constantly worked against them. Each day demanded hours of arduous effort. Pulling ropes from the riverbanks, pushing poles into the riverbed, or hoisting sails when the wind permitted. They encountered sandbars, submerged logs, swarms of mosquitoes, and sweltering summer heat. Yet, even in those early days, Lewis and Clark made it clear that this was more than just a voyage. It was a scientific expedition. Every evening, they meticulously recorded observations: plant species, animal behaviors, weather patterns, and river conditions. They sketched maps and measured distances with chains and sextants. They weren't just exploring. They were systematically documenting the new American frontier. The Corps traversed lands occupied by numerous Native American tribes, people who had inhabited these rivers and plains for generations and possessed intimate knowledge of the region. The expedition's first significant interaction occurred with the Oto and Missouri tribes near present-day Nebraska. The meeting was formal, diplomatic, and crucial. Clark presented gifts and medals, while Lewis explained the United States' new claims over the territory, a concept many Native leaders viewed with skepticism. Still, diplomacy largely prevailed for the moment. The Corps pressed onward. Wildlife became both a source of wonder and a threat. Grizzly bears, previously unknown to Americans, proved far more aggressive than anticipated. Swarms of gnats and mosquitoes relentlessly tormented the men. Bison herds thundered across the plains. Prairie dogs, never before seen by Easterners, so fascinated Lewis that he attempted to ship one back to Jefferson alive. By October 1804, after 5 arduous months on the river, they reached the Mandan and Hidatsa villages in present-day North Dakota. There, as snow began to fall and the Missouri iced over, the Corps constructed Fort Mandan and prepared to spend the winter among the tribes. They had covered hundreds of miles, but the most challenging part of their journey still lay ahead. The Rocky Mountains awaited, as did the vast unknown beyond. As the Missouri River froze and snow deepened, the Corps of Discovery settled into winter at Fort Mandan, a basic but sturdy log structure built near the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes. It was late 1804, and temperatures plummeted far below zero. The men spent the season repairing gear, replenishing provisions, and interacting with the local tribes, whose hospitality and knowledge would prove invaluable. The Mandan and Hidatsa were experienced traders and farmers. Their villages buzzed with activity even in the depths of winter, and their generosity helped the Corps survive. The two tribes also possessed something even more valuable than food: intelligence. They spoke of mountains ahead, of distant rivers, and of a mysterious tribe called the Shoshone, who lived near the western edge of the known world. A tribe Lewis and Clark desperately needed to find, because if there was any hope of crossing the Rockies and reaching the Pacific, they would need horses, and the Shoshone were known to possess them. And this is where Sacagawea enters the story. During their stay, Lewis and Clark hired a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau as an interpreter. He arrived with his young wife, a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who had been kidnapped as a child and sold to Charbonneau. Though still a teenager and pregnant at the time, Sacagawea quickly proved to be far more than just the trapper's wife. In February 1805, she gave birth to a son, Jean-Baptiste, nicknamed Pomp by Clark. Just 2 months later, with her infant slung on her back, Sacagawea set off with the Corps as they resumed their westward journey. Her presence transformed the expedition. First, she served as an interpreter, able to communicate with Shoshone bands they would later encounter. Second, she possessed knowledge of some of the terrain ahead. And third, perhaps most crucially, she was a symbol. A woman carrying a baby signaled peace to the tribes they met along the way. War parties didn't bring families. The Corps of Discovery departed Fort Mandan in April 1805 with improved supplies, better maps, and renewed hope. Ahead lay roaring rivers, towering mountains, and challenges none of them had faced before. But now, they had Sacagawea, a quiet force who would shape the fate of their mission. As the core of discovery pressed deeper into the continent in spring 1805, the Missouri River began to transform. The once wide and muddy current narrowed, twisting through rocky valleys and growing more turbulent. The surrounding land was no longer gentle prairie. It was rising, rugged, and wild. The expedition was entering the upper Missouri Basin, and the terrain was turning against them. They soon encountered one of their most formidable physical challenges: the Great Falls of the Missouri. Instead of the single waterfall Lewis had anticipated, they faced a series of 5, a 21-mile obstacle of rapids and cascades. The Corps had to carry boats and supplies across dry land in a brutal portage. Took over a month of exhausting labor. The men hauled tons of cargo across prickly pear cactus fields and through swarms of biting insects, all while dragging hulking boats over rolling terrain with makeshift wheels. Despite the hardship, the portage was also a turning point. The falls confirmed that the expedition was on the correct path. Native accounts had mentioned the falls, and reaching them suggested that the fabled Northwest Passage, if it existed, might lie just beyond. But the river didn't lead them to an easy route west. Instead, it led them directly into the Rocky Mountains. By August 1805, the Corps had reached the Three Forks of the Missouri, where the river splits into the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin. They followed the Jefferson River, tracing Sacagawea's childhood memories in hopes of finding her people. Soon, they encountered a small group of Shoshone, and in an extraordinary twist of fate, the chief turned out to be Sacagawea's own brother, Kamiwait. The emotional reunion couldn't have come at a better time. Through Sacagawea and the newly gained trust of her tribe, the Corps secured horses and guides, essential for the next leg of the journey. The dream of a water route to the Pacific was fading, but with horses and Shoshone support, crossing the Rockies was now possible. The river had brought them far, but now it was the mountains that would truly test them, and the next few weeks would prove to be the most grueling of the entire expedition. With Shoshone horses now secured and the dream of a Northwest Passage by water officially dashed, the Corps of Discovery faced their next and most grueling ordeal: crossing the Bitterroot Mountains, a snow-covered range in western Montana and Idaho that made the Rockies seem merciful. This was no longer mere exploration. This was pure survival. Guided by the Shoshone and later the Nez Perce, Lewis and Clark led their men into the high passes of the Bitterroots in September 1805. Just as early snowstorms began to strike. The path was a nightmare. Steep, narrow, and blanketed with snow. The men slipped along icy trails, their hands and faces cracked from the cold. They found no game to hunt. Their horses were collapsing from starvation, and the men were reduced to eating candles, soup made from animal hides, and whatever roots they could scavenge. At times, they could barely cover a mile per day. By the time they descended into Nez Perce territory, the Corps was on the brink of collapse. They were emaciated, exhausted, and barely alive. The Nez Perce could have attacked them. They had the numbers and the element of surprise. But instead, the tribe chose mercy. The Nez Perce fed the men dried salmon and camas root and helped them recover. It was a pivotal moment. Without the Nez Perce, the expedition might have perished right there, buried in a mountain pass. Once they recovered, Lewis and Clark retrieved their horses and built new dugout canoes. The rivers now, the Clearwater, the Snake, and eventually the mighty Columbia, would carry them the rest of the way to the Pacific. But they now knew something they hadn't known at the start. There was no direct water route across the continent. The Northwest Passage that generations of explorers had hoped for simply didn't exist. The mountains bisected the continent. Still, they had made it across. The Corps pressed on, racing against the approaching winter, braving new rivers and new dangers. But spirits were rising again. They had endured the worst nature could throw at them, and the scent of the ocean was no longer a fantasy. It was real, and just ahead. In October 1805, after months of relentless hardship, the Corps of Discovery emerged from the wild interior and began their descent down the Columbia River, a waterway that would finally lead them to the Pacific Ocean. For the first time in over a year, they were traveling downstream. The landscape was shifting. The air was wetter, the forests denser, and the rivers teemed with salmon. But it wasn't smooth sailing. The Columbia, though majestic, was treacherous. Rapids, whirlpools, and jagged rocks made navigation perilous. One wrong move could smash a canoe and send supplies or men to the bottom. Several boats capsized, and equipment was lost. Yet the Corps pressed on, driven by something stronger than fear, the imminent proximity of their goal. Along the way, they passed through lands inhabited by powerful and populous tribes, the Walla Walla, the Yakama, the Chinook, and others. Trade and diplomacy continued. In some cases, tensions rose, especially when tribal customs clashed with the Corps' military discipline. But no battles erupted, and many tribes offered fish, roots, and information in exchange for trinkets, knives, or Jefferson's silver peace medals. Then, in mid-November 1805, they saw it. The Pacific Ocean, or more precisely, they saw the Columbia River's estuary, churning with tidal waves and storm winds. Clark wrote in his journal, "Oh, in view. Oh, the joy! They had made it." After more than 4,000 miles across rivers, plains, and mountains, the Corps of Discovery had reached the far western edge of the continent. But the Pacific didn't exactly roll out a red carpet. The Corps arrived just in time for a miserable coastal winter. Rain fell for weeks, winds howled, supplies were low, the men were cold and soaked, food was harder to find than expected, and trading with local tribes proved complicated. The Corps voted, including Sacagawea and Clark's enslaved man, York, on where to spend the winter, eventually selecting a sheltered spot south of the river. There, they built Fort Clatsop near modern-day Astoria, Oregon. They would remain there for the next 4 months, documenting coastal wildlife, crafting maps, and preparing for the long journey home. The mission was halfway complete, but the most perilous part still lay ahead: getting back alive. In March 1806, after 4 soggy, bone-chilling months at Fort Clatsop, the Corps of Discovery packed their gear, burned what they couldn't carry, and turned eastward. They had reached the Pacific, but getting home would be no mere victory lap. The return trip was every bit as challenging as the journey west. Their supplies were low, their clothes were worn to rags, and the spring rains turned trails into mud once again. They relied on the generosity of native tribes to survive, including the Clatsop, Nez Perce, and Walla Walla, trading what few items they had left for food, horses, and directions. Recrossing the Bitterroot Mountains was as miserable as the first time. Snow still covered the high passes and game was scarce. The men were thinner, hungrier, and more weathered, but also more experienced. What had once been blind guesswork was now guided instinct. After crossing the divide, Lewis and Clark split the Corps into 2 groups to explore more territory on the return. Lewis went north toward the Marias River, hoping to better define the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. His group encountered hostile Blackfeet warriors, leading to the only violent conflict of the entire expedition. 2 young Blackfeet were killed in a skirmish after attempting to steal guns and horses. Clark's group, meanwhile, followed the Yellowstone River, charting new routes and naming landmarks, including the famous Pompey's Pillar, which still bears Clark's name etched into the rock. By late summer 1806, the 2 groups reunited near the Missouri River. Spirits were high. The land now seemed smaller, and landmarks once unfamiliar were now old friends. When they reached the settled edge of Missouri, news spread quickly. They had made it back alive. The Corps returned to St. Louis on September 23, 1806, greeted like heroes. They had been gone over 2 years. Many had assumed they were dead, but they returned with maps, journals, 178 new plant and animal species, and detailed information about dozens of native tribes. They had crossed the continent and, more importantly, proved it could be done. For a young nation still discovering its identity, the return of Lewis and Clark wasn't just the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a frontier. The return of the Corps of Discovery marked the conclusion of an epic journey, but also the commencement of its enduring legacy. Lewis and Clark were celebrated as national heroes. Their journals were lauded, and their maps became the foundation of American westward expansion. They had not discovered a continuous water route to the Pacific, but what they brought back was far more valuable: a clear depiction of the vast, rich, and complex American West. President Jefferson was delighted. The expedition had fulfilled its mission and then some. The scientific specimens alone were astonishing: Plants, animals, fossils, even live animals like prairie dogs and magpies were sent to Washington. The detailed accounts of native nations, their customs, languages, and political structures became essential reading for future explorers and policymakers. But for Lewis and Clark, the story didn't end so neatly. William Clark went on to a long public career. He became governor of the Missouri Territory and superintendent of Indian affairs. He raised Sacagawea's son, Jean-Baptiste, nicknamed Pomp, and continued to engage with native tribes throughout his life, sometimes as a friend, other times as an enforcer of U.S. expansion. Meriwether Lewis, however, struggled. Appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory, he was plagued by political conflict, debt, and declining mental health. Just 3 years after the expedition, in 1809, Lewis died under mysterious circumstances, likely by suicide, along the Natchez Trace in Tennessee. He was only 35. As for Sacagawea, her life after the expedition remains partly shrouded in uncertainty. Records suggest she died young in 1812, though some oral traditions claim she lived much longer. What's clear is that her presence was essential. Without her, the Corps might never have made it through the Rockies or gained the trust of key tribes. Her strength, endurance, and quiet intelligence fundamentally altered the fate of the expedition, even if history books didn't always grant her full credit. The Corps of Discovery reshaped how Americans perceived their country. They demonstrated that the continent was vast, interconnected, and already inhabited by diverse, sovereign nations. They opened a door that would soon be flooded with settlers, soldiers, and ambition. Lewis and Clark didn't just explore new land. They stood at the precipice of something far larger, the future of the United States. And it would never be the same. Beneath the bustling footsteps of tourists and the vibrant life of Istanbul lies a world crafted in silence. A world that once sustained the Byzantine Empire, drop by precious drop. It is known as the Basilica Cistern, and if you didn't know to look for it, you might never suspect that beneath the cobbled streets and clamor of modern life, an ancient cathedral of water still breathes. Built in the 6th century during the reign of Emperor Justinian I, the cistern is more than a mere storage tank. It is a palace turned inward. Measuring over 9,800 square meters, it once held up to 80,000 cubic meters of water, all concealed beneath the city's foundations. But this was no mere pit. This was architectural elegance, a subterranean marvel fashioned with vision and purpose. Justinian ordered its construction following a catastrophic fire and a series of rebellions that rocked the city. His empire, already scarred by plague and riots, could not afford water shortages, not for its palaces, its public baths, or its citizens. The cistern was intended to ensure survival, to offer Constantinople a secret wellspring in times of siege and uncertainty. But perhaps what makes the Basilica Cistern most breathtaking isn't its scale. It's its unique style. 336 marble columns, each approximately 9 meters tall, support the arched ceiling like silent sentinels. Many were repurposed, stolen, some might say from older pagan temples. Their disparate styles hint at the improvisation and urgency that accompanied their installation. As you descend the stone staircase and enter the chamber, the temperature cools, moisture clings to the air, and the surface of the water ripples quietly beneath wooden walkways. All around you, shadows dance across columns bathed in amber light. This space was never intended for public viewing, yet it was constructed with such reverence for form that it rivals any above-ground basilica in grandeur. It's an inverted cathedral, designed not to praise the heavens, but to contain the earth's most essential gift. Centuries of war, empire, and religion shifted, but below, in the stillness, in the darkness, the Basilica Cistern waited, hidden, preserved, and ready to be rediscovered by a world that had forgotten what lay beneath its feet. In the heart of ancient Constantinople, water wasn't just a necessity. It was strategy, survival, and sovereignty. The Basilica Cistern was not the city's only reservoir, but it was among the largest and most crucial, designed to serve the great palace of Constantinople. It was fed by aqueducts stretching miles from distant springs in the Belgrade forest, including the monumental Valens Aqueduct. The city's population was enormous for its time, hundreds of thousands, all demanding fresh water not just for drinking, but for public baths, fountains, and even imperial gardens. During times of peace, water flowed freely through the city's intricate systems. But Constantinople was as much a fortress as it was a metropolis, and siege was always a looming threat. The cistern's genius lay in its invisibility. While invaders could cut off aqueducts or poison external wells, they couldn't touch what they didn't know was there, hidden beneath a nondescript building. Once a basilica, hence the name. The cistern acted as a secret reservoir, supplying the palace complex and surrounding districts, even when war battered the city's walls. Its construction was a feat of both engineering and immense manpower. Thousands of enslaved people, laborers, and artisans worked under imperial orders. Materials were recycled from across the empire, particularly from temples in Asia Minor. That's why, when walking among the columns, some are ornately fluted, others plain, and still others oddly mismatched. They were borrowed, repurposed, and given new life in the service of empire. Though its function was purely practical, its design is undeniably beautiful. Light filters down in golden shafts. The columns disappear into still, dark water. The silence is broken only by the gentle lapping of droplets falling from the ceiling. Visitors today describe it as otherworldly, haunting, elegant, like a cathedral built for ghosts. Over the centuries, as empires fell and others rose, the basilica cistern slowly faded from public memory, covered over, forgotten, and eventually left off maps entirely. It became one of the city's hidden arteries, still holding water, still performing its function long after its creators had turned to dust. Few places embody Constantinople's quiet genius better than this underground sea. It wasn't just architecture. It was defiance made of stone, water preserved beneath a burning, crumbling world. For centuries, the basilica cistern was forgotten. Not destroyed, not ruined, simply hidden. As the Byzantine Empire crumbled and the Ottoman Empire rose, the city transformed. Churches became mosques, palaces were rebuilt, streets shifted, and names changed. But the cistern remained, quietly collecting water beneath it all, shrouded in darkness and silence. By the time the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, the cistern had already faded from collective memory. The Ottomans, brilliant architects themselves, had their own systems for water management. They rarely utilized the older Byzantine systems, considering them relics of another era. And so, the basilica cistern fell into obscurity, not demolished, just ignored. Yet, as is often the case with buried wonders, it couldn't remain hidden forever. Stories began to circulate. Locals in Istanbul's Sultanahmet district claimed they could draw up water and even catch fish by lowering buckets into holes in their basements. Some spoke of eerie echoes and voices emanating from underground. Others swore their cellars stayed unnaturally cool, even in the sweltering summer. Curiosity stirred. It wasn't until 1545, nearly 1,000 years after its construction, that the cistern was formally rediscovered. A scholar named Petrus Gilius, working on topographical studies of the ancient city, listened to local rumors and investigated. Entering a private home, he descended by torchlight into the darkness. And there it was, a vast, echoing chamber of water and stone, perfectly preserved beneath the earth. He described the space with awe, columns disappearing into the darkness, fish gliding through silent water, and the occasional faint ripple from above. His writings reintroduced the cistern to the world, and slowly, its legend resurfaced. Yet, even after its rediscovery, the cistern remained mostly neglected. Locals occasionally used it as a well or a fishery, but it wasn't restored, lit, or open to the public for centuries more. It remained the domain of shadows and whispers. It wasn't until the 20th century, with modern archaeology, tourism, and restoration, that the basilica cistern emerged once more as a wonder of Istanbul. But in that long sleep, sealed beneath a living city, it accumulated something precious, mystique. And in that mystique, it became something more than a reservoir. It became a legend. Walking into the basilica cistern feels like stepping into a forgotten world, one where time hangs in the air like mist, and every sound is swallowed by stone. The moment your foot touches the wooden walkway, you're enveloped by 336 marble columns, rising from dark water like a forest carved by forgotten hands. Each one stands nearly 9 meters tall, supporting the vaulted brick ceiling above like ancient titans holding up the earth. But these columns weren't originally made for the cistern. They were recycled, pulled from abandoned temples, palaces, and forgotten ruins across the empire. Roman, Greek, and even pagan craftsmanship converged underground, making the cistern a kind of mosaic not of color, but of cultures. Some columns are smooth and plain, others are ornately fluted, topped with Corinthian capitals. A few are chipped or asymmetrical, revealing their second-hand nature. It's as if each one carries its own forgotten story, divorced from its origin, reborn to hold water instead of gods. The ceiling, composed of brick and mortar, forms a web of silent arches. The architecture is functional yet awe-inspiring. The scale is almost spiritual. The air is cool, damp, and heavy with centuries. Light glimmers on the water's surface, reflecting the pillars and arches in shifting, hypnotic patterns. You can hear water drip from the ceiling, a gentle rhythm that echoes off stone and whispers into the cavern beneath the walkways. Carp swim lazily through the dark water, descendants of those introduced long ago. They are the only living souls who have never left. There's a reverence here, not in the religious sense, but in the sheer weight of time. You are surrounded by columns taken from temples, set by the hands of enslaved people, forgotten by empires, and now carefully lit for modern eyes. The space is quiet, not because it must be, but because people instinctively fall silent, as if the cistern itself demands respect. This isn't just a ruin. It's a living memory of Roman grandeur, Byzantine pragmatism, Ottoman indifference, and modern wonder. The columns don't just hold the ceiling. They hold history, they hold silence, they hold the space between the ancient and the now, and ask nothing of you except that you listen. Tucked away in the far northwest corner of the cistern, past rows of shadowed columns and flickering reflections, lie two of the most mysterious and iconic elements of the basilica cistern: the Medusa heads. These massive stone carvings serve as the bases of two columns, their origins unknown, their purpose debated, and their expressions forever frozen in stone. The first Medusa head rests on its side, supporting a column as though casually discarded. The second is even stranger. Upside down, her serpent hair hanging downward into the dampness, her face eerily calm. No plaque explains them, no inscription reveals their source. They simply exist. Where did they come from? Most scholars believe they were brought from a late Roman temple, possibly dedicated to the goddess Athena, and reused as convenient building material. Another example of Justinian's empire repurposing its past. But the fact that two identical mythological figures were chosen, both hidden in a dark corner of the cistern, suggests something more than random recycling. Medusa, in Greek mythology, was a gorgon, a creature with snakes for hair whose gaze could turn men to stone. Symbolically, her image was often used as a form of protection, carved on doorways, shields, and floors to ward off evil. Could this be why she was placed here? A protective talisman beneath the surface, guarding the lifeblood of the city? Or is it something more political? Some historians argue that placing Medusa upside down or on her side was a symbolic gesture, a rejection of pagan power in favor of Christian rule, as if to say, the old gods are underfoot now, silent, powerless. But nothing is confirmed, and that's what makes them powerful. The dim lighting that falls on their faces, the sound of dripping water around them, and the way they rest under centuries of weight, it all creates a feeling that they are watching. Not malevolent, not angry, just present. They are the unexplained echo in an otherwise orderly space. You come for the columns, you stay for the stillness, but it's the Medusa heads, silent, strange, and submerged, that haunt your thoughts long after you've left. The basilica cistern is more than an architectural marvel. It is an experience for the senses. Step inside and the modern world blurs. Your eyes adjust to the dim amber glow. Your ears catch the echo of a single droplet falling from the vaulted ceiling, and suddenly, you're no longer in Istanbul. You're in a space where light, sound, and time drift differently. Sound behaves unusually here. Footsteps don't echo in the typical way. They ripple, bouncing softly off wet stone. Conversations are hushed, not out of etiquette, but instinct. The weight of centuries presses down. Even the fish seem to swim quietly, as if they, too, respect the silence. Then there's the light. During the day, a few natural shafts filter down from above, pale sunbeams that pierce the gloom like searchlights from another world. At night, or in the deeper corners, modern lighting casts dramatic shadows across the columns, highlighting their rough textures and mismatched forms. Every shift in perspective reveals something new. A different column base, a change in ceiling height, the glint of moisture on a stone face. The still, dark water, only a few feet deep now, becomes a mirror. It reflects the columns above, doubling the perceived height of the space and transforming the cistern into a hall of illusions. At times, it's difficult to distinguish where the stone ends and its reflection begins. The surface is occasionally broken by the gentle ripple of a fish or the fall of a droplet, as if the cistern is breathing slow, calm, ancient. In modern times, artists and musicians have been drawn here to perform. Its acoustics are unmatched. The hum of a single cello, the slow chant of a voice become otherworldly. The cistern doesn't just echo. It holds sound, much like it holds water, long after it has been created. But even without music, the space feels alive. Not haunted, but aware. Every arch feels like a gateway, every column a sentinel, every sound a whisper from another era. The basilica cistern isn't just something to see. It's something to feel. A sacred pause beneath the noise of a city, a place where shadow becomes story and silence becomes a kind of song. For centuries, the basilica cistern existed in the margins, a practical space built for survival, later forgotten, and then rediscovered. But in the modern age, it has become something entirely different. A symbol of Istanbul's layered identity, a blend of empire and myth, water and stone, east and west. Restoration efforts began earnestly in the 1980s, as interest in preserving Istanbul's ancient wonders grew. The cistern had suffered neglect, flooding, and occasional misuse, even serving at times as a dumping ground or illegal fishery. But conservation teams drained the water, reinforced crumbling columns, and installed wooden walkways and subtle lighting. By 1987, it was officially reopened to the public. Tourists began to trickle in, then flood in. What had once been invisible beneath the city's surface became one of Istanbul's most visited landmarks. Travel magazines marveled at it. Photographers sought its shadows. Writers found metaphors in its stillness. Directors, of course, saw something else entirely: atmosphere. The basilica cistern soon became a cinematic backdrop, lending its haunting ambience to everything from documentaries to blockbusters. Most famously, it appeared in the James Bond film From Russia with Love, 1963, where 007 navigated a small boat between the columns beneath Istanbul. More recently, it was featured in Inferno, 2016, adapted from Dan Brown's thriller, transforming the ancient reservoir into a stage for modern suspense. But the cistern is more than a film set. It is a mirror of Istanbul itself, a city constantly built atop its own past. Churches beneath mosques, palaces beside skyscrapers, history underfoot. The cistern reminds us that even beneath our everyday lives, the remnants of great civilizations remain, waiting patiently, hidden just beneath the surface. Its transformation from utility to icon is part of what gives it power. It no longer holds water for emperors, but it holds meaning for locals, for travelers, for artists. Connects the present to the past without words or ceremony. A place once built in secrecy now draws the world to whisper its name. It is no longer just a cistern. It is a threshold to mystery, memory, and the unseen heart of a city that refuses to forget. Walking through the basilica cistern today, it's easy to overlook how fragile it once was, how close it came to being lost entirely. The structure has no lavish entrance, no towering facade. It was never meant to dazzle, it was meant to disappear. And yet it has survived earthquakes, invasions, neglect, and the unyielding march of time. But survival doesn't happen by accident. The cistern owes its preservation to a series of quiet guardians. Not emperors or generals, but engineers, scholars, and curious locals who refused to let it fade. During the Ottoman period, it was unofficially maintained by residents who accessed it through wells and cellars. They may not have known its full scale, but they valued what it offered: cold, clean water, and perhaps a sense of mystery beneath their homes. In the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars like Petrus Gilius and later Turkish archaeologists began documenting the cistern in earnest. They mapped its columns, traced the origin of its marble, and began asking the questions that transformed it from a hidden space into a subject of fascination. Their quiet dedication became the first steps toward restoration. And in modern times, it's the caretakers, guides, and preservationists who guard it now, maintaining its structure, balancing humidity, controlling algae, and ensuring visitors walk safely on suspended walkways. The still water must be managed, the columns must be monitored, even the light must be delicately balanced. Too much and it shatters the mood. Too little and the past slips back into shadow. It is also guarded by storytellers, those who share its history, who translate the silence into meaning. Every guide, every documentary, every quiet traveler who lingers a moment longer in front of the Medusa heads, they, too, become keepers of the cistern. And let's not forget the locals. Istanbulites who grew up hearing tales of fish in basement wells, of shadowy stone rooms beneath the city. For them, the cistern is not just a tourist site. It is a neighbor, a legend they've always known was just below the surface. So while the empires above have fallen and the palaces they served are now museums, the basilica cistern endures, not because it demanded attention, but because generations refused to let it be forgotten. Not all guardians carry swords. Some carry flashlights, notebooks, or simply respect. The basilica cistern is more than stone and water. It is memory suspended in silence beneath the pulse of modern Istanbul. It remains untouched by the rush of taxis, the clang of tram bells, or the call to prayer ringing out above. Here, everything slows. You do not so much visit the cistern as descend into it, as if entering a dream whispered by the earth itself. Its true power lies in its stillness. Nothing here is loud. Nothing insists. The columns don't shout. The arches don't boast. The Medusa heads don't explain themselves. And yet everything speaks, softly, patiently, if you know how to listen. The water mirrors the ceiling mirrors time. You begin to wonder if the place is truly underground or just outside the edge of reality. This isn't the kind of monument that celebrates conquest or faith. It doesn't have golden domes or mosaic saints. It simply endures. Its beauty lies in how it refuses to vanish, how it transforms the practical into the poetic. Built to hold water, it now holds wonder. Each visitor leaves with something different. For some, it's awe that a structure so ancient could still be so intact. For others, it's tranquility, a moment of escape from the chaos above. And for many, it's mystery. Why were the Medusa heads placed that way? Who shaped these columns? How many forgotten hands labored in silence to build this place that still breathes today? As the tour ends and you climb the steps back toward daylight, the spell doesn't quite break. You emerge into the sound of cars and footsteps, into sunshine and the smell of roasted chestnuts, but part of you stays behind. Part of you still hears the dripping water, still sees the flicker of golden light on ancient stone. The basilica cistern is not just a relic. It is a reminder that beneath every empire, every city, every story, there is something deeper, something older, something waiting in the dark. Still waters run deep, they say, and in the heart of Istanbul, they echo forever.